Keep your best years ahead. Longevity Roadmap with Dr. Buck Joffrey.
Welcome back to the Longevity Roadmap. This is Buck Joffrey, and today our guest is Dr. Nicola Conlon. She's a pioneering molecular biologist and entrepreneur at the forefront of aging research and longevity science, and as the co-founder and CEO of Nido. Is it Nido?
Nido, yeah.
Okay. As the co-founder and CEO of Nido Laboratories, she translates cutting-edge scientific discoveries into practical interventions for healthier aging. She's got a PhD in physiology from Newcastle University and brings expertise in cellular aging and drug development to her work. And her research focuses on NAD, which we've talked about quite a bit on the show. It's a crucial molecular player in cellular energy production and repair that declines with age, and we'll talk a lot about that today. Dr. Conlon, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so, let's start out with some of the basics here. Obviously, NAD, you see it everywhere these days. You see it in med spas and people getting pumped in with NADH and all that kind of stuff. Let's go to the basics here. What exactly is NAD and why is it important for our bodies in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great insight in that, yes, NAD has suddenly become this buzzword and this thing as if it's all of a sudden just been discovered. But we know it hasn't. It's something that's been known for, over 100 years. And its main function in the body, or the one it's most famous for, I guess, is actually for our cellular energy production. So in our cells, we have our mitochondria, and they literally take the food that we eat and convert it into ATP, which is the main energy currency of the cell. And anyone who remembers anything from biology will remember something called the Krebs cycle. Yeah. And this is a cycle that produces the ATP in our cells. And NAD is a very, very important part of this process in producing cellular energy. So we've known about it for a long, long time. We know that because of its importance in cellular energy production, that it is literally found in every single cell in the body. But I guess the reason that it's become a bit more famous recently, and certainly is hitting the spotlight with, I guess, your non-scientists and your more average consumer, is for its role more in repair. And we know that NAD is very, very important for also powering a lot of the repair processes that we have in our cells. And unfortunately, our NAD levels decline with age, and this repair starts to get turned down. And this is where we start to see many of the effects on our cells, the cellular damage that causes or drives the aging process. So actually NAD's role in aging is kind of what has made it a lot more famous recently.
Yeah, especially with Dr. David Sinclair. I think he probably created a lot of the buzz with that lifespan book. Talk about sort of the, some of the nuts and bolts here. Like, for example, what is meant by NAD cell compartmentalization?
So this is all about the idea that, we talk about NAD and having it high or getting low, but actually the amounts of NAD in our cells can be quite different in different compartments. So if you look in your cell, there are lots of different parts. You've got the cytosol, which is sort of the free area in the cell, and you've got the organelles, which are your things like the mitochondria or the nucleus or, the ribosomes, things like that, which are all almost little compartments, little factories within themselves that are actually doing their own little job. And if you are to really go into detail and look at the levels of NAD in different parts of the cells, this can fluctuate. So, for example, NAD should naturally be quite high in the mitochondria because that is where it really is performing one of its main functions in driving respiration.
So you talked a little bit about NAD declining with age. What are sort of the what are some of the consequences of that decline in age?
Yeah, so the decline in age, just to touch on that in a little bit of detail, is actually quite significant. So when we're talking about it declining, when it's been measured in various tissues in the body, in not just in animals but also in humans, we find that it seems to half every 20 years. Our levels half every 20 years. So that means even
Starting when?
starting from birth,
From
believe it or not.
birth. No
Yeah,
kidding. Oh,
yeah.
jeez. Okay. All right.
And this again, I say this a lot, but I'm always alarmed when I say it because if you think I've just told you how critical it is in every cell, and
Yeah.
even by the time we're 20, we've lost half our NAD supplies. By the time we're 40, that's halved again. By the time we're 60, so what we see,
I see.
when we look at this on a graph, shall we say, is an exponential decline. It really, really does drop off steeply. And that's obviously a bad thing because, first of all, if we don't have enough NAD, our energy production is going to go down. So in the cells, you can see our mitochondria are just not as efficient anymore. They're not as efficient at taking our food and turning it into energy. So, if cells don't have enough energy, this impacts everything they do. But on the outside, we feel that it's things like a lack of physical energy, feeling tired, fatigued, a lack of stamina that we used to have when we were younger. Also, the cognitive side of energy, our brains require a lot of energy. So we see this as brain fog and mental fatigue. And then if you look at the other aspects of what NAD is doing, so things where it's actually driving repair and cellular maintenance, as NAD goes down, NAD is not there to act as a fuel to drive these processes. So again, we start to see cellular damage. And when the cells start to become damaged, that starts to cause a whole host of many different issues that we associate with aging. And this is mainly because a lack of NAD in the cells drives what we call the hallmarks of aging. So 12 critical cellular processes that start to fail as we get older that drive the entire aging process.
So why does the NAD go down? Why? I mean, from birth to 20, why do we have the decline? Is there something functional, deterioration or change in the mitochondria themselves, or what do we know, or do we just know that it does?
We have theories.
Yeah.
I think the main thing is that, as with anything in biology, there is never one root cause. There's always multiple different things that are going on that are all kind of accumulating and having an impact on certain things. And certainly in the case of NAD, when you look at all the different pathways that are involved in it, all the different pathways that are involved in making it and using it and recycling it, there's so much going on. And what it seems is that there are multiple different causes of why NAD seems to go down. And even up until fairly recently, as scientists, we didn't properly understand why NAD falls. But now it's quite clear that there are two main reasons, at least. The first reason is that the process in our cells that naturally makes it declines as we get older. So one common misconception is that we get our NAD from our diet and, we can eat things with NAD in it and that's how we replenish it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. NAD is a very unstable molecule. It doesn't get through the gut, and it certainly doesn't get into the cells. So all of our cells actually make all of the NAD that they need inside the cell.
Mm-hmm.
So it's made right where it's required. And we have a pathway in our cells called the salvage pathway. And literally what this pathway does is every time some NAD is used up, it gets broken down into its building blocks, which we call precursors. And this salvage pathway literally scoops them back up, sticks them back together and turns them back into fresh NAD again. So it's quite a clever mechanism by the cell because it means that as the demand for NAD goes up and the use for NAD goes up, then the body has more precursors available ready to recycle back into fresh NAD again. So it kind of keeps or it should keep our NAD levels in balance. But what we see is that for some reason, and this is where we're not quite sure why, but as we get older, one of the key enzymes in this pathway, and it's an enzyme called NAMPT, this enzyme actually declines with age. So that means this natural production process and recycling process in our cells that's making and recycling all our NAD, that goes down as we get older. And we know that this significantly reduces NAD in the cells. So that's one of the main reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The second one is actually, so I always say that's like the production issue.
Yeah.
The second issue is more of a overuse issue. Okay. So again, remember that I said NAD is driving repair. It's being used as a fuel to drive many repair processes and to deal with any damage in the cells. So as we get older, our cells have been around longer. They've got more damage, they've got more inflammation, they're not as good as repairing themselves anymore, and they need more NAD to actually fix this damage. So you start to see the demand for NAD go up. And this is right at the time when our cells aren't as efficient at making it. So you start to get this deficit. And the other thing is also inflammation. We know now chronic inflammation drains our NAD supplies. And we know a lot of people, as we get older, become chronically inflamed at a low level, but it's still there smoldering away. And again, this drains our NAD supplies.
What is that drain? What's that mechanism?
So the main mechanism is through an enzyme called CD38. So CD38 is an enzyme that basically, it's like a signaling enzyme in our cells. And when it's switched on, it drives inflammation. So this is good when inflammation is needed. So, in an acute inflammatory response, it's switched on, it tells the cell to have its inflammatory reaction. But what we see in older people is that they don't always seem to turn down this inflammatory reaction. And we see excess of this CD38 sitting on the surface of their cells, just constantly being stimulated. Now, CD38 uses NAD as a fuel. And it's a prolific NAD consumer. So just to put this into perspective, so NAD, when I say it drives repair, one of the famous elements of cellular repair that it drives is DNA repair. So we've got an army of DNA repair enzymes in our cell that goes around making sure any damage is fixed. Now, every time they're working, they use around 6 or 7 molecules of NAD. CD38, on the other hand, when it is driving inflammation, uses around 100 molecules per cycle. So even a very small change in inflammation can have a huge impact on your NAD levels.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess that's driving this thing we call inflammaging sometimes. Let's talk about sort of the role specifically as, related to longevity too. Can you explain the relationship between NAD and some of the sirtuin pathways? The sirtuin pathways, for reference, people, we've talked about that before on the show, are thought to potentially relate to some of the longevity pathways. So how is NAD related to them?
Yeah, so the sirtuins are also very famous. If you've done any research on NAD, you'll have come across the sirtuins. And that is because they actually work together. So when I'm talking about NAD having all of these positive effects on the cell, where it induces repair, it lowers inflammation and things like that, it's not actually the effect directly of NAD. It's the pathways that NAD switches on. Now, the sirtuins are basically, they are enzymes. They sit at the top of a pathway, essentially, and they wait to be switched on. And when they are switched on, they activate many, many positive cellular pathways. So pathways that reduce inflammation, pathways that stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis, pathways that make sure autophagy for cellular recycling is switched on, pathways that power DNA repair. Now, the link here is that for the sirtuins to be activated, they need NAD. So again, NAD is acting as a fuel. So if you have NAD available in the cell, it will activate the sirtuins and it switches on all of these beneficial pathways.
Yeah.
When NAD is not available, or when it's being used by things like CD38, they outcompete the sirtuins for the NAD, and unfortunately, the sirtuins don't get switched on, and you don't get all these beneficial downstream effects happening. So in the longevity space, the sirtuins are very famous as these longevity proteins or longevity genes. Everyone talks about them. And a lot of people talk about, let's activate these longevity genes, these sirtuins with different compounds, like SIRT activators, the most famous being resveratrol. But the issue here is that you can activate them, but actually if they don't have any NAD, they are never going to work no matter how much you try to stimulate them in other ways. So actually the most important stimulator for the sirtuins is actually NAD itself.
Got it. And so let's talk about the idea of increasing NAD levels, because obviously when it comes to longevity, if you want these sirtuins turned on to be turned on and to be functional, you need to maintain and potentially increase the levels of NAD. And that is, that's going to help potentially with a number of things. First of all, why don't you talk about, if you could, and then we'll get into how you can do that. But what have you seen in clinical studies or in animals when you are able to increase NAD levels?
Yeah, the benefits are vast. And whenever I do presentations and I talk about the benefits of NAD, it almost, when you're saying it all, it's like, this sounds too good to be true. It's like, oh, it helps with this, it helps with that.
Like snake oil.
Yeah, like literally, you feel like a snake oil salesperson because, it sounds too good to be true. But all the studies are there that show, if you're looking at a cellular level and you're boosting NAD, you see improved DNA repair, improved mitochondrial function, improved autophagy. Everything that is keeping a cell in good health, you see turned up. If you go to a more whole body system, so starting looking at tissues and organs, you see regeneration of liver, improved kidney function, huge benefits to neurological conditions, brain tissue, nerve tissue. The benefits across the body are vast.
What do we have though in terms of clinical human research?
So in terms of the human research, there's less human research than animal studies. So there's a huge amount of data in cells. There's a huge amount of data in animal studies. And now all of this is starting to filter through to the human studies. So in terms of those ones, we've seen things like improved muscle function, cognitive function. There is studies going on in things like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's disease. There was a human clinical study done in heart failure. And we saw an improvement in heart failure patients. Another marker that we do see improvement in human clinical studies is inflammation. So a lowering in this chronic low-grade inflammation. And certainly some of the studies that I've been involved with, we've looked at that. And I guess the other thing that we're now starting to look at in terms of NAD is its link with biological age, and this idea that you can measure biological age, and can things like increased NAD be used to reverse biological age? And again, even now in a human clinical study, we've seen that you can reverse the biological age with NAD.
Yeah. So let's talk about how you do that. Now, one of the things I want to sort of get off the table here right now, because I think it's one of these med spa things that people are capitalizing on. And I assume you agree with this, but infusing a bunch of NAD directly into your blood is not going to be helpful. Maybe if you agree with that or disagree, tell us why.
I spent a large amount of my time answering that question, and I wholly agree. And what I always say to people that as a scientist who's actually studied NAD and published papers on it, I would never let anyone
Yeah.
give me an NAD infusion. And unfortunately, again, this has become a fad. This has become something that everyone's going, oh, well, NAD is this amazing thing to boost, so let's just get it in our body in any way possible. But unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. So first of all, I guess even before NAD IVs and injections and things like that popped up, people had this idea that when we realized that NAD was something you wanted to increase in the body as you got older or maintain levels, first of all, it was thought, well, why don't we just take pure NAD? Literally chuck it in a capsule, knock it back, and done. But unfortunately, you can't do that because NAD is very unstable. It's degraded by the gut and it's not absorbed. The other thing was then, okay, so if we can't do that, why don't we infuse it? So this is where these infusions came about, because we're going to bypass the gut. We're going to make it fresh every time. So we're not going to have this degradation issue, and we're going to get it straight into the blood and everyone will be happy. Now, again, unfortunately, yes, it gets it into the blood, but NAD does nothing in the blood.
Right.
NAD has to be in the cells because that's where it performs its function. That is where the sirtuins are. That is where our mitochondria are. That is where all the pathways that NAD is important for interacting with or powering, they all are found within our cells. Now, unfortunately, trying to get NAD from the blood into the cell is actually tricky because it's a very big molecule and it's also a charged molecule. So we see it, NAD plus because it's a charged molecule. And this size and charge of the molecule means that it can't just freely diffuse into our cells. Cells are quite picky about what they let in and out. And for big molecules like that, most cells have to have a special channel or a little door, essentially, that's going to let it in. And the majority of the cells in our body do not have any channels to let NAD in. There are a couple of exceptions. So we know that the heart and some of our neurons do have these channels, but the vast majority of the cells in our body cannot let this pure NAD in. So what that means is that people are getting these infusions of, very, very large amounts of a molecule into their blood that then gets stuck. That is absolutely not meant to be in the blood in that level or that concentration. So
you're just basically peeing them out at that point? Or are they getting stuck somewhere or what?
Your body has to suddenly work very hard to break it down. And if you ask anyone who's had an NAD IV, they will tell you it is not pleasant. They feel sick, they feel nauseous, their chests tightening, they're sweating. And this is because the body's suddenly like, oh my goodness, we've got to get rid of this out of the blood. So it starts metabolizing it and you start to see it getting excreted as the breakdown products.
Right.
But even more worrying than that is a recent study that I don't think it's been published yet. It's in a preprint, but they actually looked at an NAD infusion clinical study and they found that infusing NAD as an IV actually triggers an inflammatory response, which is obviously exactly not what we want to do.
Yeah, it's counterproductive. Yeah. And so this is something that I actually have talked to a number of people about. And obviously, the good news for people is that, you can save your money because a lot of times these things are really expensive too.
Yeah.
The alternative is, of course, to provide the components for the body to create NAD within itself, within the cells. And to date, the two most common of these molecules, these precursors, which are of course related in the pathway as well, are NMN and NR. And do you want to start out by talking about those and how they're different and what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, so NMN and NR, as you mentioned, they're the precursors. So they are like the building blocks, which are smaller, that your body can use to make NAD. So the thought process behind this was when we realized that NAD was too big to be taken orally, everyone was like, well, let's look at a smaller precursor like NMN or NR. Can we absorb those? And can they actually be absorbed into the cells? So what we know is that you can. So there are lots of clinical studies now looking at these molecules. We know they don't actually get absorbed into every single cell still. So there are some cell types that miss out. But we do see an increase in NAD levels in the cell with these molecules because these are small enough to get in, and then they can go into that pathway, that salvage pathway, that then makes them into the larger NAD molecule. So again, for a long time as scientists, we thought, well, this is perfect. We're giving the body more of the raw material that it needs to make this precious molecule. But then we started to learn about why NAD actually declines. And what we know now is NAD declines because that pathway, that salvage pathway that's actually taken the precursors and turning them into NAD, that actually declines with age. So then it was like, oh, well, this is a bit of an issue because we're given our cells all these precursors hoping they're getting made into NAD, but that's not what's happening because the cells don't have the capacity to do it anymore because that key enzyme in that pathway that does this conversion actually declines with age.
Mm-hmm.
So when people take precursors, I often say it's a bit like if you think of the cell as an NAD producing factory, and if you went into the cell and this factory and you were like, why has my NAD production gone down? And you realized it was because the machines were broken, there is no way that you would just go, oh, well, let's ignore the fact that the machines are broken and let's just order more raw material and hope we get more NAD out the other end. You wouldn't do that. You'd say, well, actually, we need to start looking at fixing the machines and fixing the pathway. And this is exactly what all the latest science in the NAD space shows, that if we want to boost levels of NAD efficiently, we must actually fix that pathway in the cell so that our cells can actually do something with these precursors.
So that being said, there are studies showing that if you do provide NMN and NR, that you do see increases.
Yes. So there are plenty of studies,
Yeah.
but what you do see also in these studies, which was always the surprising bit, was that when you look at like a dose response curve, you would expect that if it was just a supply issue, that the more of the precursor that you put in, then it would directly equal more NAD out. But actually what you see is that you can increase the dose of things like NR and NMN to a certain point and NAD will continue to rise. But you get to a point where it doesn't matter how much more precursor you put in, the amount of NAD just plateaus.
Yeah.
So this was one of the clues where we were like, what's going on here? Why is this conversion not happening? Why is it plateauing? Why is there this ceiling? And then the really interesting thing that you start to see is whilst NAD is plateaued, you start to see something called methyl nicotinamide go through the roof. And this is like an excretory product. So it turns out what's happening is as you're piling all this precursor in the cell, that salvage pathway to a certain extent can deal with it. It can turn some of it into NAD, but then it becomes overpowered because it just doesn't have the capacity because there's not enough of this enzyme in the cell. So the precursors then start to actually build up in the cells. And again, cells don't like it when things go out of homeostasis, when things start to build up. So when these precursors start to build up, what the cell does is it tries to get rid of it out of the cell. And it does this by switching on a methylating enzyme, an enzyme called NNMT, which basically sticks a methyl group, which is like a signaling tag in the cell, and it sticks the methyl group onto the precursor and signals it for excretion out of the cell. So we suddenly start to see a huge increase in this methyl nicotinamide. Now, you can kind of sit there and think, okay, well, great, the cell's just getting rid of it. But actually, this is pretty bad because our methyl groups are not supposed to be used for this purpose. They're supposed to be getting used for things like DNA repair and epigenetics, switching genes on and off and things like that. But they start to be plowed into dealing with this problem that they shouldn't be dealing with. And then what we start to see is people become methyl donor depleted. So you'll often see on forums and, talks about NAD, people will say, oh, if you're taking precursors, make sure you take trimethylglycine or betaine or something at the same time, which are methyl donors to prevent this. But really, it's kind of like back to the issue we have with certain drugs where you're taking one drug to fix one thing and then you happen to take another drug to counteract the side effect of the first one. We're now starting to get in a situation like that with supplements.
Right. So that's what I think is a good time probably to bring up your product then, Nido Time Plus. Tell us about, so first of all, what's in that medicine?
So we have, what we did was say, okay, so precursors are kind of like a first generation of NAD boosters. They kind of fix part of the problem, but science has now moved on and we know all of these issues that we've already explained that are actually causing the NAD decline. So we know that not only is it a supply issue with the precursors, but we've also got the issue of the salvage pathway not working. We've also got the issue of chronic inflammation because of CD38. We've got this methylation issue also going on. So actually, if you really want to boost NAD levels, you need to take what we would say is a whole systems approach. You need to look at all these different root causes and do something that's going to impact all of them. So what we did was design a formulation that has multiple different ingredients in it, not just a precursor, but multiple ingredients in it that actually fix all these specific issues that we've just been talking about. So, for example, we have an ingredient in there called rutin, which comes from a bark extract called Sophora japonica. And what this does is it actually activates the key enzyme in that salvage pathway. So that is the NAMPT enzyme. It's the rate limiting enzyme in that pathway.
Could you just obviously, since we've thrown a lot at people, remind people what that particular enzyme, exactly what we're doing there? Again, what its role is?
So this enzyme is what we call a rate-limiting enzyme in the salvage pathway. And the salvage pathway is the pathway in the cells that makes and recycles all our NAD naturally. But it's the one that declines as we get older, which means it's like, the machines in the factory. The machines are becoming less efficient. So what we do with our product is actually switch back on this enzyme. So we use...
So rutin actually, does it create production of that enzyme, or what does it do to that enzyme? Okay.
So it directly stimulates the cell to physically have more of the enzyme. So it's not just it's increasing the activity of the enzyme that's already there. It's actually making the cell have more of that enzyme. And we also use another ingredient called alpha lipoic acid, which works in a similar way to stimulate the production of this enzyme. So there is literally more of the machines in the cell that are making and recycling NAD. So that's part of it. So that's fixing the production part. The other part is inhibiting some of these processes that are draining our NAD levels. So namely CD38. So just to remind people, CD38 is something that we have chronically expressed in our cells as we get older that drains NAD through inflammation.
Right. So that was what you were talking about, sort of the reservoir that sort of drains from inflammatory tissues have this CD38. The cells have CD38, and the more inflammation you have, the more CD38, and the more you're basically draining NAD out of the system.
Exactly that. Yeah, it's exactly that. So what you really want to be doing is looking at ways that you can inhibit CD38. So CD38, just to, again, like, even if you do nothing else, like if you don't put any precursors in there, if you don't fix the salvage pathway, just by inhibiting CD38 even a little bit, you can have a huge impact on your NAD levels because it's such a huge consumer of NAD. And people often go, oh, but would I want to be inhibiting something that's driving inflammation in my cells? Because yes, it drives inflammation when you're healthy, and it does good things as well. But because it's such a huge consumer, even just a very small amount of inhibition creates a huge difference to the amount of NAD that's available in your cell. So the ingredient we use to inhibit this is something called apigenin.
Got it. And so does it make sense at all to combine that with something like NR, just so that you have an increase in the machinery, but you also increase the precursor as well?
Exactly that. So we actually have a precursor in our product, but we don't use NR and we don't use NMN. We use a different precursor, and this is just plain old nicotinamide, which is a vitamin B3. In fact, NR, NMN, nicotinamide are all derivatives of vitamin B3. If you look at the structures, they're all very, very similar. So the reason that we use nicotinamide over NR or NMN, despite the fact that they're the ones that are popularized, nicotinamide is actually the one that your body prefers to use. It is the natural version that your body uses usually to make NAD. It's the one that the salvage path uses. And the other thing is that it's actually freely bioavailable. So that means that it can actually be freely absorbed into any cell in the body.
Well, is it hard to absorb in the GI system though?
No, so nicotinamide, it's something that literally it doesn't need a special carrier to get through the membrane. It can diffuse through. On the other hand, NR and NMN both need special channels to get through. NR has, from what the research shows, that is the one that has the most bioavailability. NMN, there's a lot of argument in the scientific space about whether there are channels that actually directly take it up into the cells or whether it's first converted to NR and then it goes up. But the main thing here is, again, everyone's getting distracted by which one's better, NMN or NR, when actually the best one is actually just plain nicotinamide.
Yeah.
Which is interesting that everyone kind of ignores the research on that. But that's what we include in our product as well.
Got it. So what have you seen in your trials, your clinical trials, or the human research?
So for us, it was so important. When I founded Nido, the main reason I did that was because I believe there was a real lack of longevity products out there that actually had good science behind them. There was, a lot going on in drug development, which is my background and where I'm from. But, at the moment, there are no drugs available for this purpose. So how could we translate some of this research into consumer products that actually had good, credible scientific testing behind it? So we did a full double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study. And the first thing we obviously wanted to look at was, does it increase NAD? It does, which was a big tick in the box. Yeah. So, after just 7 days, you start to see an increase in cellular NAD levels, and this continued to rise across the course of the study. But I think one of the most exciting bits was its mechanism of action. So again, we know there are other products out there that are boosting NAD to a certain extent. But what we wanted to do was create a product that's actually fixing the root cause of the problem rather than ignoring it. And also by switching back on our cells' natural NAD production. So we actually measured levels of that NAMPT enzyme, that enzyme in the salvage pathway that usually produces all our NAD, but declines as we get older. And what we saw was a significant increase in levels of this enzyme. And that's how we know that those ingredients we were talking about earlier are actually acting to increase levels of, or the amounts of this enzyme in the cell.
And those enzymes, do we know for sure that you don't get an uptick with those when you use an NR, NMN? You just don't get that uptick? Do we know that, or is that an assumption?
So there's no studies to show that. We know there are certain things that will increase levels of these enzymes in the cells. The interesting thing is that a lot of the things that we know that are already good for us and, healthy practices, so things like fasting, exercise, they actually work by activating cellular stress pathways that actually, the main one is something called AMPK, that actually switches on levels or activates the expression of this enzyme to increase NAD levels naturally. So what our compounds are doing are mimicking that process as if we were fasting or we were exercising to increase levels of that enzyme.
Yeah.
The other thing, sorry, carry on.
No, I was just curious if you had any potential head-to-head data, like comparing the
Like
outcomes
NMN and NR and
versus Nido product, anything like that.
Yeah, no, we've never done any head-to-head studies because the primary outcome in our study was not a comparison study.
Sure.
This was does it do what we're, a mechanism of action, and does it have the primary outcome of increasing NAD? So we've never done that because what we wanted to show was that this is the first human clinical trial that actually shows you can switch back on natural NAD production.
Got it.
Like you can fix the issue. The other thing we really wanted to demonstrate was that, as we discussed earlier, or actually we didn't touch on this. We talked about IVs, but what we didn't touch upon was the fact that now some of the human studies that are coming out with NMN and NR have some evidence that they can drive inflammation. And again, this is like not what we want to be doing. And the reason is that if you are boosting NAD in the cell, but you have a high amount of CD38 expression, whilst you are in good faith trying to increase levels of something that you think is going to be activating the sirtuins or it's going to go towards repairing DNA, the reality is that in chronically inflamed people, the NAD gets directed towards driving inflammation because CD38 as an enzyme has what we call a high affinity for NAD. And it's got a higher affinity for NAD than any of the other NAD consumers in the cell. So the repair enzymes, the sirtuins. And what that means is if suddenly NAD becomes available, CD38 will literally grab it and use it before the sirtuins or the DNA repair enzymes or any of the useful things even get a look in. So this is why we're seeing some evidence that you think NAD boosting is a good thing, but sometimes it's producing chronic inflammation. So in our study, what we wanted to do was look at what is happening with inflammation, because we know that our product is designed to inhibit CD38. So technically that increase in NAD that we're getting should be going to drive positive things like the sirtuins. So what we see is an increase in SIRT1 expression. So we see that the sirtuins are activated. And we also saw a reduction in inflammation. So again, this makes us confident that actually this NAD that we are boosting is actually going to where we want it to go in the cell and being put towards useful processes.
How did you measure inflammation there?
So that was an inflammatory cytokine panel. So we looked at the interleukins for that one.
Okay, got it.
The other thing that we measured was biological age. Because again, we wanted to show what impact is this having on cellular health. And we looked at I don't know how familiar you are with all the different biological age tests, but we did a biological age test called glycan age, which to a certain degree looks at levels of chronic inflammation as well across the body. And we actually saw a reduction in biological age by 1.26 years in just 28 days.
Interesting. Is this product, Nido Time Plus, is this available in the U.S.?
It is available, yeah. It is available in the U.S., yeah.
Yeah, I just was asking because I know you're in the U.K. So yeah, got it.
Yeah, no, we're in the UK, but when we actually launched the product back in 2019 now, actually, we actually launched in the US. So yeah, we have a big customer base in the US.
Got it. And one last question. Where'd you come up with the name Nido?
It's a mouthful, isn't it? I'm not going to lie.
I was going to say, you don't look like a Japanese person that named Nicole Nishido or something like that. So,
well, the Japanese hint is there, and
right.
To be fair, it's a made up word, but it does have some meaning behind it. And the meaning is, if you look at the blue zones, these areas in the world where people live to great age, Okinawa in Japan is a very famous one, and they actually have a famous saying to do with longevity, which is nushi gusui, which is food is the path to long life. So we kind of took the nushi bit and do as way, so it loosely translates to way to long life. And also, it's very hard to get a name that nobody's already trademarked. So that's why we have to be a bit creative.
So you probably get the domain name and everything, right? So,
exactly.
Speaking of which, how do you get the product?
So just at our website, Nichido.com. So Nichido is spelt NUCHIDO.com. And yeah, just head on to the website. We've got a lot of education on there, all about, how each of the ingredients worked. I know we've touched on that. Also about the clinical studies. We've also done further clinical studies where we've looked at skin quality, sleep, energy levels, all sorts of different things.
Yeah. Fantastic. So Dr. Nicola Conlon, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Fascinating information, and love to have you back in the near future.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks.
A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe.